It was an ordinary evening, nothing unusual. I had just gotten home from school, dropped my backpack on the floor, and headed to the kitchen. The air was filled with the delicious smell of something cooking, making my stomach growl. My stepmom was there, like always, moving around the kitchen with a grace that made it feel like her domain. We had always gotten along well, so I thought. She had married my dad a few years ago, and though things were awkward at first, we eventually settled into a comfortable routine. She was young, much younger than my dad, and people had gossiped about their relationship. I didn't pay attention to that though. She had always been kind to me, always making sure I was taken care of when my dad was at work. But that day in the kitchen, something felt different. The way she looked at me over her shoulder, her smile lingering just a bit longer than usual, I shrugged it off at first, thinking it was just in my head. But as the minutes passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She was wearing a simple dress, nothing too revealing, but the way it hugged her figure was hard to ignore. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the sounds of the stove, the clatter of dishes, and the low hum of the fridge, but my eyes kept drifting back to her. Every time she moved, every time she bent down or turned toward me, I found myself watching her. At one point, she caught me staring. I quickly looked away, feeling my face grow hot, but she didn't seem bothered. In fact, her smile widened, as if she knew something I didn't. "Why are you just standing there?" She teased. "Come help me." Her tone made me hesitate, unsure of what to make of it, but I stepped closer anyway, closing the gap between us. She handed me a knife and some vegetables, telling me to chop them while she continued cooking. We worked side by side, the kitchen filled only with the sounds of cooking, but the air between us felt thick with something unspoken, something I couldn't quite name. Our hands brushed a few times, accidents of course, but each touch sent a shock through me. Each time she glanced my way, her eyes seemed to sparkle with something I couldn't define. Was she flirting with me? The thought sent my mind spinning, but I quickly pushed it away. She was my stepmom. After all, she wouldn't be doing that, would she? Yet, as the evening wore on, the tension between us became almost unbearable. Every moment felt charged, every glance, every accidental touch. My heart was racing. And no matter how hard I tried to stay focused on what I was doing, my thoughts kept drifting back to her. At one point, she leaned over me to reach for something on the counter, and her body brushed against mine. It was subtle, but it was enough to make me stop breathing for a moment. She didn't move away immediately, either. She lingered there, her chest lightly pressed against my back, her hand resting on my shoulder as she reached past me. I froze, unsure of what to do. My brain was screaming at me to move, to put some distance between us, but my body refused to obey. She was so close, her breath warm on my neck, and for a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. It was just the two of us standing in that kitchen, trapped in a moment that felt like it might never end. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. She pulled back, her hand grazing mine as she did, and she returned to the stove as if nothing had happened. My heart was still pounding, heat creeping up my neck, but she acted like everything was perfectly normal. "Thanks for the help," she said, her voice too casual. "You can go relax now. Dinner will be ready soon." I nodded, muttering something under my breath as I left the kitchen, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was I reading too much into something innocent? But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Over the next few days, things between us continued to change. She became more playful, more flirty, and every interaction felt like it was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. There were more lingering touches, more shared glances, and each one left me feeling more confused than the last. I didn't know how to deal with it, didn't even know if I wanted to. Part of me was terrified of what might happen if I gave in to whatever this was, but another part of me, a much bigger part, was curious, intrigued, excited. One night, after my dad had gone to bed, she called me into the kitchen again. At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming she needed help with something. But when I walked into the room, I realized this time was different. She was leaning against the counter, a glass of wine in her hand, and the look in her eyes sent a shiver down my spine. "Come here," she said softly, her voice low and inviting. I hesitated for only a moment before walking toward her. She smiled as I approached, setting her glass down behind her on the counter. She didn't say anything she didn't need to. The tension that had been building between us for days finally reached its breaking point, and before I knew it, her lips were on mine. The kiss started gently, hesitant, like we were both testing the waters. But it quickly grew deeper, becoming more intense with each passing second. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer, and she responded in kind, her fingers tangling in my hair as she pressed herself against me. The world around us seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of us in that kitchen, locked in an embrace that I knew was wrong, but I couldn't stop. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to stop before it went too far, but my body wouldn't listen. Each touch, every kiss sent waves of electricity through me, and all I could think about was how much I wanted her. So after a moment, she pulled back, breathless, looking up at me with eyes darkened by desire. "We can't do this," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. I nodded, but neither of us moved away. Instead, we stood there, inches apart, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. It felt as though we were teetering on the edge of something that could change everything. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. She stepped back, breaking the spell that had held us both captive. She looked away, her cheeks flushed, and I could see the inner conflict playing out in her eyes. "This never happened," she said softly, more to herself than to me. I didn't know what to say, or if there was anything I could say. All I knew was that things between us had shifted, and there was no going back. In the following weeks, we both tried to act as if nothing had changed, but the tension between us only grew stronger. Every time we were alone together, it felt like an invisible force was pulling us toward each other. And no matter how much we tried to resist, we kept ending up in moments that felt too intimate, too dangerous. I knew it couldn't last. I knew something had to give eventually, but until then, we danced around each other, caught in a web of desire neither of us could escape. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and excitement. Every time I crossed paths with her, it felt like we were playing a dangerous game, one without clear rules but with impossibly high stakes. My mind was constantly torn between guilt and the undeniable thrill that came with our secret. She acted normal around my dad as if nothing had happened, but when he wasn't looking, I could feel her eyes on me. It was subtle. The way she would brush past me, or how her hand would linger just a moment too long when handing me something. These small interactions, though seemingly innocent, were electrifying. It felt like we were communicating through touch, through brief glances, saying things we couldn't put into words. One night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, my thoughts were a tangled mess of what-ifs and unanswered questions. I kept replaying that night in the kitchen, the feel of her lips on mine, the way her body pressed against me. A part of me wanted to forget, to pretend it had never happened, but a much larger part of me craved more. I wanted to feel her again, to explore whatever was brewing between us, even though I knew it was wrong. It was late, probably past midnight, when I heard a soft knock at my door. My heart leapt into my throat as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The knock came again, quieter this time, as though the person on the other side didn't want to be heard. I hesitated for a moment before swinging my legs out of bed and quietly crossing the room. When I opened the door, there she stood in the hallway wearing a loosely tied robe. Her hair was slightly messy and her eyes were wide, as if she hadn't expected me to answer. We stood there, silent, for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. "I couldn't sleep," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "I keep thinking about you." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the pull between us stronger than ever. Without thinking, I stepped aside, silently inviting her in. She glanced down the hall, making sure my dad wasn't around, before slipping into my room and softly closing the door behind her. The air seemed to thicken as she moved across the space, her eyes never leaving mine. She stopped in front of me, her hands nervously fidgeting with the belt of her robe. I could see the internal battle playing out on her face. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, though she made no move to leave. I reached out, my hand brushing her arm, and she shivered at the touch. Her robe slipped slightly, revealing more of her skin, and the sight made my heart race even faster. She looked up at me, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her eyes filled with desire. "I know," I whispered back, my voice rough, "but I don't want you to go." She closed her eyes as though fighting against herself, but then, without warning, she surged forward. Her lips crashed against mine in a desperate, hungry kiss more intense than before, filled with all the emotions we'd been holding back for weeks. Her hands were all over me, pulling me closer, tugging at my clothes like she couldn't get enough. I reacted the same way, my fingers slipping under her robe, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath them. She let out a quiet moan, and the sound sent a surge of desire through me. Everything else faded away: the guilt, the fear, the consequences. In that moment, nothing mattered except her, the way she felt in my arms, the way she kissed me as if she'd been waiting for this her whole life. We stumbled backward toward the bed, our movements hurried and clumsy. Her robe fell to the floor, forgotten, and I couldn't stop myself from taking in the sight of her. She was stunning, more beautiful than I'd ever realized, and the fact that she was here with me made it even more intoxicating. She pushed me onto the bed, straddling my lap, her hands roaming over my body with a hunger that matched my own. I could feel the heat radiating from her, and every time I touched her, her breath caught. It was overwhelming, the intensity of it all, and I knew there was no turning back now. We spent the rest of the night entangled with each other, pushing the boundaries of our relationship. Every kiss, every touch, every whispered word only deepened our connection. By the time the sun began to rise, I knew things could never go back to how they were before. But as daylight broke, the weight of reality settled in. As we lay there, still wrapped up in each other, the enormity of what we had done started to sink in. This wasn't just a fleeting moment, it was a betrayal, not only of my father, but also of the trust we'd built over the years. She was the first to pull away, her face a mix of regret and longing. She didn't say anything as she slipped out of bed and put her robe back on, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. "This can't happen again," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We can't keep doing this." I didn't argue, even though every part of me wanted to. I knew she was right, we had already crossed a line, and going any further would only lead to more pain. But as she moved toward the door, a wave of sadness washed over me. I didn't want it to end, even though I knew it had to. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. For a moment, I thought she might say something that would change everything. But instead, she just glanced back at me, her eyes full of the same sadness I was feeling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and then she was gone. The days that followed were filled with confusion and guilt. We avoided each other as much as possible, and when we did cross paths, we pretended like nothing had happened. But the tension was still there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to explode. I tried to move on, to forget about that night, but it was impossible. Every time I saw her, I was reminded of how she had felt in my arms, the taste of her lips on mine. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop wanting more. Then, one night, it happened again. It was late, and my dad was away for work. I was in my room, trying to distract myself when I heard a soft knock at the door. My heart jumped into my throat, and I knew before I even opened it who it would be. She stood there just like before, her robe loosely tied around her waist, her eyes filled with that same mix of desire and regret. We didn't say anything, there was no need. The moment she stepped inside, we were lost to each other again. We fell into each other's arms, our kisses urgent and desperate, knowing this might be the last time. Every touch, every word was filled with the knowledge that we were crossing a line we could never uncross. And by the time the night ended, I knew things could never be the same. As the sun rose the next morning, she slipped out of bed, her face heavy with guilt. We didn't speak as she got dressed, and when she left, I knew it was truly over this time. In the days that followed, we barely talked, and the tension between us was replaced by a cold distance neither of us could bridge. She threw herself into being my father's wife, and I tried to move on, though the memory of those nights haunted me. Looking back, I know what we did was wrong. We hurt people who trusted us. But in those moments, caught up in the heat of our forbidden love, none of that mattered. All that mattered was how we made each other feel, how we gave in to the desires we had fought so hard to suppress. It became a secret we would carry with us forever, a reminder of the lines we had crossed and the consequences we would have to face.